Hello and welcome back to the Cutie Art Crusaders, episode 2, part 2 of the back-to-back premiere that we're running this week on Everfree Radio. Welcome back, guys. It's a bit awkward because we're recording this about a week after we recorded the first one, but I'll get into that in a moment. For right now, I am your host, Rainbow Plasma, and today I'm joined by...
Burndle1.
And Flutter Guy.
So yeah, like I mentioned before, we're recording this a week later. We were going to release that one last week and do that, but there's a bunch of complications, so we decided just to run like a 2-episode premiere. So now you get back-to-back of us, and hopefully now you've kind of recognized our voices. By the way, Pinky Dash is away this week. He's off doing Australian things. I'm not really sure.
Whatever Australians do.
I mean, somebody needs to inform me about what Australians actually do, because...
I think he's taming koalas.
You might be rescuing his kangaroo from a crocodile. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I could do an accent to kind of like make up for the fact he's here, but I'm horrible at accents.
Don't even try. Yeah.
No, I'm not even gonna try. Okay, so this week we've got something really special for you. We've got kind of what the show's going to be. I remember last week we had this like drag about having to show our own work, and we were not really excited about that, and blah blah blah. So this week we actually get to go in more in depth about art itself. So to do that, what we're going to do each week is we're going to have something called a theme, and the theme for each week is going to be kind of a way for us to focus our thoughts about art and display different pieces while keeping it kind of, relevant to each other. So this week's theme is show accuracy. So, for example, in this week, we'll be talking a lot about show accuracy and how that relates to fan art and how it can be used properly, improperly, all that jazz. So, just to start off, I'm going to talk a little bit about what show accuracy is, and then Bern's going to talk about a little bit about vectoring. So, show accuracy is basically what it sounds like. It's the similarities to the show. So if you have a show accurate piece of fan art, it means it looks almost exactly or very close to what the show looks like. It uses very similar styles or shading or whatever to make it look like it came from the show itself. And that's basically it. I mean,
At least just mimics the style of the show.
Yeah, it mimics it, and it's a way to relate the fan art back to the show. Vectors, as we mentioned last week, vectors are a very good way of doing this, and it's the prime example of a show-accurate piece of fan art, because, well, that's what they're trying to do. Well, most of vectors are trying to imitate the show, whether that be through tracing or original style or stuff like that. But I feel like last week we didn't really get into what a vector was. People might have been a little bit confused about what a vector was. So I'm going to have Bernd here explain a little bit more in detail about what a vector is so that you guys have just a little bit more of a clear idea.
Alrighty. Well, what is a vector? Basically, to kind of sum it all up, a vector is a recreation of an image or creation of an image using paths, strokes, and shapes. And basically, to kind of sum that down, what a shape in vectoring is, it's kind of like a cutout piece of paper, but it's a magical little piece of paper that you can infinitely scale however you'd like. So a vector is an image that you would see that people create from the show using paths and strokes and different programs, but it can infinitely scale, so you can put it on the side of a billboard, you can put it, and then you can make it the size of an icon, and it will never lose resolution, because it's making these little cutout pieces of shapes and complex polygons and curves. So the effort put into making a vector isn't quite the same as drawing. It's almost designing an image to be able to look how you want it to look, no matter what the resolution.
It's a very mathematical way to make art. It's less flowy. Like if you're using like a brush, it's not as flowy as that. It's more about, clicking and dragging lines. It's a very it's like the math nerd's way to make art.
I've heard it been called the perfectionist's art because you're constantly tweaking things, and it's not really about going through with a brush and trying to make things look right that way. It's more you're constantly like going back and forth and trying to get everything to fit together properly.
Yeah, definitely. In vectoring, like it's code. I forget what type of code, but you can actually go in a vector and you can problem solve the code and see if there's some like glitches or problems with the code, because every single point and every single line has a designated spot where it's supposed to be, and that's what allows it to scale, is because it says if I'm at 10,000 pixels, I need point A to be here, point B to be here, and then a line connecting it.
Now, vectors aren't only just, show accurate traces. This is the main way that I think vectors are used, is to kind of quote unquote trace. We'll go into tracing a little bit later because I know some people have some questions about that. But the main way that people use vectors is as a resource, but they're taking something directly from the show and recreating it like node for node and color for color, stroke for stroke, that kind of stuff. But there's other ways to do that as well, and we kind of like to go into that and mix vectors with show accuracy because they're kind of closely tied together. So we kind of want to do that.
There's definitely a lot of professional things that vectors are used in, but as far as like artwork goes, it's more of just how people will play with paths and strokes. And then because the My Little Pony is animated in Flash, and they use strokes and paths to animate the show, is why vectoring carries over so closely.
Yep, and actually directly opposed to vectoring, because vectoring is a word to describe this type of art. You have raster art, which is your normal traditional digital art, where you have pixels and each pixel is a specific color instead of being defined by mathematical shapes.
Yeah, well, each shape is still defined by said color.
Yeah.
But you can go into an SVG and change those shapes' colors, which you can't do in a bitmap.
Cool. So this week we've selected 4 different pieces of artwork that kind of exemplify the show accuracy theme, and we start with vectors because, well, they're basically how the show is created in the first place. So our first piece of art is called Egghead Rainbow Dash Wallpaper by Julian12826, and this is like your typical trace vector, basically lifted right off of a scene from the show, and you can see that you can basically scale it to any size, and all the details will still be there. This one is particularly interesting because it has a background and Rainbow Dash in it. A lot of vectors that you'll see will only have the character or they'll only have the background, but sometimes vector artists will kind of mix and match like that.
He has a version of just the background without Rainbow Dash in it. This one he added Rainbow Dash.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things to learn from vectoring to do with show accuracy, because obviously it's meant to. That's one of the biggest parts of vectoring is finding out how to make it as close to the show as possible. So there's a lot of things we can learn about it, and there's a lot of things that this vector in particular can teach us about different show accuracy points. Like, I know, Bernd, you were talking about the fact that in the show itself, background objects, like for example, if you look at Rainbow Dash's bed or her bedside tables or the picture frame or whatever, they don't have the same outlines as the characters do.
Yeah, that's correct. Backgrounds in the show, pretty much nothing has background stroke to it. Even statues in the show that are statues of characters of ponies, those don't even have strokes on them. They're actually strokeless, which make them sort of stand out a little bit less. But everything living, like birds, weasels, ponies especially, will all have strokes and outlines to them, so they pop, so you can tell where the edge of their shape is, and it's a little bit darker, and all the colors are always nice and like a little desaturated, but it really makes that character come alive, and you can tell that it's popping out of the scene and from this. So like on her bed, when she's lying on her bed, you can tell where her colors are and like pops out, especially like the top of her hair and stuff like that. But everything in the backgrounds, it's laid back, it flows nicely. It's the same kind of feel you get when you watch Samurai Jack, because Samurai Jack was one of the first cartoons, on Cartoon Network that did not have outlines in the show. And you can even get some more unique things, like Ed and Eddie, all the outlines were, wobbly, but that's a different artistic style.
I know outlines have been used in years and years for cartoons. If you look back to some of the oldest ones you might have watched as a kid, you can see that it's one of the easiest ways to get your character to pop out from the background is to make the background not have outlines and then have something to disconnect the character from the background. And My Little Pony does a really great job of that by having those colored outlines, because with the different colors that they present with every single character, it would be very easy to lose yourself and lose the pony in the background because not only is the background very colorful, but they're very colorful, and the colors might clash or whatever. So they've done a really good job in the show of doing that. And I think it's really important when a lot of people make art, whether or not they include an outline on the character, it makes a big difference in how the art looks.
Yep.
Definitely. Seeing a lot of original style, like black outlines on characters and stuff, is always really cool. What people can do with that, and something the show doesn't do, except maybe with Cadence, I think is an exception. But strokes are all the same color, and they're always even, and like throughout all the legs, like the background leg will even be the same color as like the rest of the body, and like the hair will change color. But regardless, the stroke's still the same color. Strokes usually don't blend into each other. Like, it'll start blue and then blend into green. Within the show, they don't do
Does
that.
Cadence do that?
I think with the
Cadence
exception of
does that,
Cadence.
yeah.
I know her colors do, and in her wings have gradients, but I'm not sure if her
I guess it makes sense. I guess her wing outline must have
Some sort of gradient.
some sort of. Yeah, I think it does. You're right.
Yeah, but a lot of artists will do really cool things with that stroke specifically, like playing with the outsides of the strokes and like starting at a basic color and then blending into others, and it can create another cool effect and pop from the background, especially if the background's a different hue.
And I gotta say, My Little Pony is one of the best examples of a show that can kind of get out of that whole cell shading with the black outlines, because you see that in a lot of older cartoons, and just recently cartoons have started to break out of that, and they've started using like these colored outlines. And one of the nice things that My Little Pony does is that they make these outlines really thick, so that you do have that contrast between the character and the background, or a character and another character, and it actually does separate it out instead of just having a thin stroke that's slightly different colored.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, how all the colors are done and like the strokes are outlined is always really well done, and like creates just a awesome feel. But like on the colors, to note, all the colors, especially in the show and with the backgrounds and with the characters, are always soft colors. They're always desaturated, and they're always pleasant to the eye. They're never harsh to look at. Especially like the character with the most extreme colors on her is Rainbow Dash, and I think that's why she stands out to a lot of people, especially aesthetically. I mean, that's why she's my favorite. She looks cool.
It's funny that you were mentioning the thick outlines, because the next piece of art that we have is something called Neat and Rushed by Cumcrum, and it's a piece of art that initially looks quite show accurate, but one of the things that sets it apart is the fact that its outlines are quite thin. It's still got the same colored aspect of it, and it still pops from the background, but you can tell, even in this picture in itself, that it doesn't quite pop quite like the show does because of those thinner outlines.
The outlines in this vector, I mean, it does give it a bit of a contrast, and there's some shading that they used on that to make it pop a little bit more. But usually in the show, the outlines are maybe twice the width as what's in this vector or artwork.
This picture is really cool, I find, just because of the way it's taken a vector. I believe this is a vector. I can't confirm that because I'm not sure. They don't have like a resource file for it. It's not a particularly large file, so I'm not sure if this is a vector or just made, just to mimic the style of the show. If it is, it's very well done, because the lines are all very, very smooth. But it's very interesting to me to see like something that looks quite like the show. Like if you look at the two original characters there, they look like they could be in the show, and he or she, I'm not sure, I apologize, did the characters very well to look like they're in the show. But you've got the subtle details, the outlines are a bit thinner. The shading is obviously something that they don't do in the show. So it's interesting to see those details, and it's a way that vectors can kind of expand past just being traces, quote unquote.
Cumcrum's indeed a lady.
Something that you'll see in the show is you won't see that much shading, like especially on characters. Instead, like at nighttime, they'll put a blue filter over it. So basically turn the entire scene like a shade of blue, or desaturate it a little bit. But very rarely do you see these shading kind of shapes on actual characters in the show.
When you see shading aspects within the show, it's always done aesthetically for like a scene reason. Like this one, like the first one that comes to mind is Pinky Dash's little piece he shared last last episode because it had the shadow from the flames going on Cadence's face. But another thing that's a big fan favorite scene is the scene with Fluttershy in the Minotaur episode, when she locks herself in her house and ties herself to the chair. That when it fades the background in and fades her into perspective, she has, when it's going to the left, the shadow of her hair goes across her face, to kind of create that ominence as it goes and looks at the door when the Pinkie Pie and Rarity are knocking. But always when they use shadows, it's always for some kind of like artistic depiction. And then like when Pinkie Pie's in the house with the two cake babies, they use some shadows in there as well to create ominence.
Yeah, but it's definitely not something that I consider show accurate for sure. It from episode to episode, you'll find the lack of shadows is very common. The shadows only come in those like very pivotal scenes, or those very, they're trying to make it look very artistic, especially that Fluttershy scene. So another thing that this picture does really cool, it kind of blends vectors and art together, is the background. The background used was actually made by another person. It was made by Anatech, and this person used it. That's what a lot of vectors are used for, as resources for different people, whether or not it be for fan art or stuff. And so you can see, again, that kind of blend of complete show accuracy, which the background is, combined with this original style. But because the style on top of it is so close to the show, it looks like the background and them were made together. Yep. And I think that's really cool, because usually when you put an original style thing on a show accurate piece in the background, it pops out and you can tell that they're two different pieces, which this one does not do.
I just have to say I love Ragtag. That's the pony on the right. She's one of my favorite OCs that I have up there. So cute. Normal.
She's quite famous too. There's the two, the story behind this, and I can get behind this 100%. This is my headcanon now. It's the two fillies are on the left Shooting Star, and on the right Ragtag, and it's two twin daughters of Rainbow Dash and Soren, and it's just characters that someone's created of, and some very artistic people, and they're quite fantastic characters. I believe it's made by Cumcrum. So Cumcrum came up with Shooting Star, and Ragtag was made up by Tuka the Wolf, and I believe they're very close friends. So very interesting characters there.
Another thing I really like about this piece is how they, if you look at like the drawings, that looks completely raster done. So like after creating this very show accurate piece in the background, and with the Fluttershy and the two girls, fillies. Sorry. They.
What is a girl?
Basically.
I am a.
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
Don't quote me on that. Do not take my quote out of context. Rainbow Plasma. What is a girl? Don't. God damn it! Why did I say that?
Where'd he go?
I'm a filly, and what is this?
Anyways, go on.
Yeah, I really like how they kind of pulled that all together, and then afterwards, kind of did these drawings. I believe in some sort of raster program like GIMP or Photoshop, and it kind of gives a contrast to the whole image between the show accurate and the not so show accurate.
Well, there's a lot of ways you can do art, and there's a lot of ways you can make something mimic the look of a vector and still not be a vector. Like the background, of course, we know it's a vector because it was made beforehand and used for this piece. But the characters, you can always use paths like in vectors and then stroke them with the brush tool in Photoshop and then fill the spaces in between. And there's a lot of ways you can do things, and which by just like you mentioned, how the pictures are indeed rasterized. It leads me to believe that that's how the artist created this work, was by that means.
I really love the paint that they have on Ragtag's hoof. It's very well done. So good job there.
And, if you notice, the paint on her hoof goes over the stroke of her arm to let you know that that's not part of her body. The show does that a lot, especially when you see characters covered in mud and things like that. But sometimes they'll put a stroke to the paint. In the Sisterhood Social episode, Applejack Rarity, gets covered in mud, and the mud has its own stroke. But differentiating from the stroke of the character is always a lot of fun.
All right.
But anyway, Moving right along, our next picture that we have, or comic rather, is by Veggie55 called Moving Too Fast.
You probably never heard of him. He's like a really obsure guy. I mean, I don't know who even looks at
Who's this
comics
guy?
anyways, right? No, I'm just kidding. Super famous. Veggie55. Everybody should know of Veggie55 and the comics he makes. And the reason why we bring him on here is because he's probably the most well-known artist in terms of the fact that he makes all of his art very, very show accurate, despite the fact that he doesn't use vectors. All of his stuff is rasterized with different techniques that he does. But it's one of the closest fan arts we found to like one of the most show accurate ones that we found.
That doesn't use vectors, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I believe his tool of trade is GIMP.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
He actually he has a video on how he puts his comics together, and they're all pencil drawn, pencil sketched beforehand, and then he basically will create lines, like small line segments, so it's like kind of pseudo curves, and then he'll just erase at the tips and at the points and get them to look nice, which is a really interesting way of doing it, as opposed to vectors.
A lot of the comic artists I've noticed, Tomorrow and other artists, all use like Photoshop or GIMP, and then they'll have ways that are completely different from vectoring and are unique to their own style, just because that's how they're used to it, and be able to make good-looking pieces by using their own methods.
By the way, I will link the Veggie55 recently made a video tutorial, and I will link that in the description if you're interested in seeing how he does that, in case you weren't already aware of that video.
Yeah, it's a very interesting, very, very interesting video.
Also, fun thing to note, if anyone watching this is also interested in learning vectoring, we all three of us and four of us in Opinion District here all know a lot about vectoring and love teaching individuals and showing people how to get started vectoring. And you can always contact us as well with how you might get started in possibly the vector community as well.
Yep.
So I think what Veggie55 does really well in his comics is the ability to I don't know how he does. He must be an amazing sketch artist. But what I gather from what he does is he takes sketches, or he might even use resources from the show, and he recreates them somehow, but changes them to be his own style. Like, obviously, I think one of the most famous things that Veggie55 does is he takes the show, and the show is obviously known for its funny faces. That's one of the things I love about the show, is its great facial expressions. And he's like made his own that look quite show accurate, but they're never faces that were in the show, but he just uses them to express emotion within the characters, and he does a really, really good job of that.
Like, for instance, in this one, in the second panel, Lyra's face is just so classic, and it looks like it could be in the show, but I don't think she's ever made that face within the show.
Well, Lyra, but another pony might have, and like used that face as a reference. Something I'd like to note is if you look at the third panel, with Lyra, she's like, "Oh, you can't be serious," and like the kind of sad face. If you look at her eyebrows, and even Bonbon's eyebrows, how it comes down over the top of the eye and it's black and it joins with those eyelashes. The eyebrow, when it comes and they look angry or like sad, it will join with their eyelashes there. But to make the illusion of eye lids, the show will separate them. If you look at the fourth panel, the eyelash is on the top with the eyelashes, and then the eyebrows are above to make her look guilty. And then Bonbon still has her angry joined face.
Another great example of the faces that Veggie creates is in this one. It's another one of his comics that I'm just going to quickly flip to here, and it's called Them's Fighting Words, and it's another Lyra and Bonbon one. And I'm pretty sure every single face that's made within by Lyra is definitely all custom, but they look great and from the show. They look like they could just fit right in. So that's another example. There wasn't really a great example of that kind of face in the other one, but this is a great one.
And again, like I was saying, creating the illusion of eyelids with on Bonbon there, like Rarity is one of the only main six that has like eyeshadow, and it's all done correctly, just how the show would do it.
Yep. So I mean, this is a good way to kind of show that you don't have to do vectors. You don't have to have, some sort of perfectionist thing to create show accurate stuff. It just all comes down to your own opinion on whether or not you want to use show accuracy at all. And in fact, you can take something show accurate and modify it and create your own style. For example, we've got someone here called, I mentioned him last week because I have a giant wing boner for him. But we have an artist here called Mystic Alpha. Oh my god, I got the name wrong. No! Mystic Alpha. And here's a great example of something that basically came from the show, was an expression came from the show, and he just modified it in such a huge way. So it's called Twilight Sparkle Bad News. And you can just immediately see the change in style, but also relate back to how it would be in the show.
Yeah, like the strong outlines and like are really strongly related, but he always takes these such cool, like, unique styles with it, like with the shading, like on the neck, how it has the ultimate dark there, and then the lighter dark, and then he has these, he's really well known for those unique lines that he uses for shading that always come off of the medium or dark part, and like on all of his pieces, they're always really coal. And I believe I've watched his YouTube videos, and they are indeed made with paths, so it has the potential to be a vector, but I don't believe it.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's really cool to see something like that where you can start with a pose, and then like through layering, if you turn off like a layer and like flip back and forth really quickly, just see the differences that are made. And it's amazing what you can do just through shading to create something that's 3D. What he does amazingly with shading is he makes everything look 3D. One of the disadvantages of the show about My Little Pony is the fact that it does look kind of flat. They do kind of look very 2D. So Mystic Alpha does an absolutely fantastic job of changing that into more of a 3D environment.
When the show tries to use like more 3D environments, they try to use color to make things pop, to add depth. So if you notice, characters' background limbs will become a little bit darker. I believe the magic number is about 15% darker is what their background limbs will become. So you can tell, obviously, that they're in the background and become shaded. And like they'll play with that, especially when they're trying to create the illusion that something's more popping up into the background.
Yeah, and
foreground, excuse me.
And shading, like this kind of shading, we don't see this particular kind of shading too much in the fan art. It's really unique to Mystic Alpha. But you do see quite a lot of fan art being created that that does use shading to kind of accentuate the 3D feel of ponies, and it kind of tends to get away from the show accuracy a little bit. But this type of shading right here, actually, you can basically see where he came from with the style of the show, and then just kind of added all of the his own unique style to it.
Yeah, Mystic Alpha definitely has some of the most unique shading that I've ever seen. I mean, it's not quite cross-hatching. It's just these lines that will come off of objects. And like he has more heavy shaded versions of pieces he's done. Like Fluttershy is a really big favorite of mine. He's a lot of Rainbow Dash pieces that are really amazing. And like he'll even put that line shading in, like in her inner tail and things like that. And it's always really well done.
This makes me love him all that much more.
Yeah, he'll do it with color too, not just with shading with lines. He'll actually blend color like that. You can see it a little bit.
Yeah, so I think that's basically it. I think that's all we can talk about in terms of art and show accuracy. There's not really much that we can go in. I'm sure we could all talk for half an hour longer, but
I'm sure.
We're all long-winded anyways. So, Bernd, why don't we go into the questions? What do we have this week?
All right. Our question this week is, isn't create a vector from a show just tracing?
Interesting.
Yeah.
This is a heavy question.
Yeah.
By the way, because we didn't have the show airing last week, we have to make up our questions again this week.
Well, this is actually a question I got from a user dealing with the My Little Pony Vector Club.
I get this question
so
many times. So I'm gonna not tackle it because I could talk for probably half an hour about it. So I'm gonna somebody else do it, and then I'll.
Yeah, I can.
Go ahead, Flutter Guy. I'll try to wrap up.
There are a lot of different, I guess, styles for vectoring. One of them is, a straight trace from the show, but there's a lot of it where you try and make the show better than it is, because, the animators have to pump out a 22-minute episode in, a couple of weeks. There's bound to be errors in the animation. There's strokes that don't line up and stuff like that. So part of vectoring a trace is fixing those animation errors. But a lot of what vector artists do actually is combine different poses from within the show, or even hand sketch their own pose and then vector over on top of that. And then we also get a lot of original style kind of artwork where artists will basically just create their own style and not go from the show at all. So there's a lot more to vectoring than just kind of tracing over a screenshot from the show.
Yeah.
It's very controversial. People definitely come up to me all the time and are just like, "Wow, you're just basically stealing other people's art," or you're just stealing the show's art and pandering it off as your own. And in a way, kind of. You know what? I can understand where those people come from, but there's one big point that I want to make, which is a bunch of the resources that people have out there would not exist if we did not have vectoring. If you look at t-shirts you buy, if you look at posters you buy, signs at BronyCon, Everfree Northwest, all of these different events, pony music videos, different wallpapers, all this stuff, you would not have that without vectors. And I'm not saying that as like, we are the best. You would not, you would be nothing without us. But I'm saying part of the biggest thing about these vector traces is being a resource. We're doing it on purpose not to steal art, but to make it more accessible for people to use and reuse and share the show. So, for example, we would vector something from the show so that you can have a large version of it, so you could blow it up if you want to put it on a poster. It's a transparent background, so you're not getting like weird color keying errors or fuzzy edges if you're trying to remove the background or anything like that. So I think the biggest thing, if you're thinking that a vector is just a trace, it's meant to be a resource. So in a way, it's meant to be a trace.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like Flutter Guy mentioned, there's a lot of individual like artwork that can come from it, and then original works that you can make from vectoring and doing it by yourself, and piecing stuff together, and then not just tracing from the show and vectoring otherwise like that. And then, like you were saying, being a resource. Like, a lot of people complain about how our strict rules and policies at the My Little Pony Vector Pub, but we have those there to be the best possible resource for the My Little Pony community and anyone who would want to make projects of their own. And we have those rules set in stone to be the most possible useful we can to provide vectors for people to use and for their own works.
If I may jump in here for just a second, I don't think we've mentioned in detail, but all four of us, Pinky Dash, Flutter Guy, Burned, and I, we're all admins on a DeviantArt group called MLP Vector Club. We'll link it in the description, but I think it's a fairly well-known group, and that's basically where it's the largest vector pony group. It's pretty large in general on DeviantArt, and that's where you're going to find all the resources. There's hundreds and hundreds of vectors there, group photos, OCs, minor characters, all the main characters, villains, resources for backgrounds or stuff. That's where you're going to find all that kind of stuff. So this is where we're coming from, by the way, with our knowledge of vectors. We're all admins on here, and we all critique work and make sure that it's the best as possible, so that when people come to us and when people come to the group wanting to use it as a resource. For example, we've gotten people for BronyCon and Everfree Northwest and We Love Fine come up to us and say, hey, we want to use your stuff. Then we want to make sure we have the best stuff to possibly give them. And so that when you guys see that, or when you guys wear that, you guys have the best resources.
And it has to go through us to be able to get into our gallery. So,
yep.
But adding on to that, and more talking about show and show accuracy, more of our theme, the show has a lot of set rules when animating and how things should be, where strokes should line up. Every character is made up of a puppet, and if you work with Flash, you'll know what that means. But those animation puppets are all pieces, and they all work a certain way and connect a certain way. And then the show builds an artistic style off of those, and the show uses programs that it's made and created individually for specifically animating the show to be able to give to its animators. And animating those puppets, it'll constantly break those rules in different things in the show, and that's when you get show animation errors, and then when vectoring becomes creating an image better than the show itself. And those rules have a lot of things to tie into show accuracy, as a feel.
Yeah, one of the...
But anyway,
yeah, go ahead. One of the major ones that I've been noticing lately is actually on Twilight's mane as it goes over the front. Because of the way that it's split into two separate shapes, you can sometimes see an animation error in the front where it basically will break. And so when you're vectoring, if a vector artist is vectoring a trace of Twilight and they come across a reference with that break in it, they'll try and fix that to, make it look more like it should look, rather than what it does look like.
Yeah, and another reason why it's animated so beautifully, and like why the characters are always like a solid color and don't have gradients, is parts of their bodies are made with solid colors to be able to blend together. So like their eyes and their mouth are all separate shapes that are, individual colors, and when they're put on the body, they're complete they're the same color, but they're completely different shapes, but you can't tell because they're connected with that stroke, and then they have the color that blends seamlessly, and it makes it extraordinarily easy to animate that in Flash, and it looks beautiful, and that's why a lot of people love it.
Yep.
But is there anything else left for you guys to input before I try to wrap it up?
No, I think I'm all talked. I could talk for hours
All
about
right.
the trace thing because I've gotten that complaint a lot. As a vector artist for months now, I've gotten that complaint a lot. If you guys think that we're wrong somehow, or if you'd like to discuss it, please send me a note on DeviantArt, and I would love to discuss, the qualities of a trace or whatever.
Well, I'm going to try to wrap that up real quick. So to try to wrap up that question, like, is vectoring tracing? Basically, the act of tracing that's frowned upon in art is when you just draw on top of someone else's image, something that's not your own. And then there's no use to it whatsoever besides just being a copy that's usually not as good as that copy, or as good as the original. And then like saying like, this is my work and this is mine. By no means at all do vector artists ever do that. We don't say that the show is ours. It's always, this is a trace from My Little Pony, so it's not frowned upon in that means. But vectoring as an art, vector tracing isn't simply just copying it. It's actually physically recreating it with shapes and with images and with paths to be able to infinitely scale, to have a use, to be able to use as a resource, to be able to change, and to be able to give it back to the community so much more than what just a simple PNG can be. I mean, you're recreating the image not only completely differently through different means, but also a completely different medium most of the times. The simile that I usually like to give people when they ask me that question is if I were to take just a screenshot of like Rainbow Dash from the show, and then I were to get this screenshot from the show, and I were to recreate it like identically with construction paper, just normal paper, like cutting out paper, cutting out the outlines, cutting out the fill color with construction paper, but magical construction paper that I can stretch and then put on top of like a building or something. That is what vectoring is, and that is why it is considered an art and is so amazing for the community. And it's not tracing, because there's a use besides just making something look like I made it. It has a use. That's the biggest difference.
Nice.
Well, I think that's all we can say about it. Well, that's all we're gonna say about it. So this wraps up episode 2. This one has run a little bit long, but we're kind of testing the waters here, seeing what you guys like in terms of length. Maybe you guys want us to talk a little bit more about stuff, go on for like 45 minutes. We're trying to keep a generally like around 30 to 40 minute time here. So let us know. We always appreciate tons of feedback about this.
Yeah,
By the way, if you're watching this on the premiere live, I know this is the second episode in a row, so you've been listening to us for more than an hour. You are awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you
you
so
guys are
much for
great.
thank you so much for giving us a chance, because we would love to have a chance to be able to talk to you guys and interact with you guys. This kind of podcast is probably panders more to a YouTube audience. We find that a lot of people enjoy listening to us talk while doing something else, like creating art of their own, and then just kind of listening to the background, and then flipping over to the YouTube video if they ever need any reference. So feel free to do that if you'd like. But for right now, thank you guys so much, and
Yeah.
I think that's basically it. Anybody else have anything to say?
Yeah, I got something to add in there.
Go for it.
If you are still tuned in, again, thank you. But like we mentioned earlier, we are going to try to get awesome guest artists and stuff on the show. And I actually do have a very exciting guest artist scheduled for our next airing next Tuesday. And they are 2 awesome professional animators that are in charge of a great, amazing project for their portfolio called Children of Night. And we'll include that in the link if you would like to go check it out. I highly recommend.
Yes.
The artists are called Spirito and Lionheart Cartoon, and they're a couple. Yeah, that's basically it.
It looks amazing.
So,
So yeah, check it out and stay tuned for next week.
Yeah.
And also,
Yeah, tune in next week if you'd like to hear us interview them.
Yep. And also, we really would love to have your feedback. and we also are looking for art submissions and questions. So if you can send those to us to our email, which is cutieartcrusaders@gmail.com. If you're sending us artwork that you think could be featured on the podcast, put artwork or art in the subject. If you're sending us a question, put question. Please send in questions because we have such a hard time coming up with them on our own. We literally spent like half an hour before this trying to come up with questions, and not nice. So we would love to hear from you, and we hope that you really like our podcast.
Also, make sure to send it, because that's kind of relevant to the fact that we have a guest next week.
Yes.
If you do know about these people, Spirito and Lionheart Cartoon, and have any questions to send in, then definitely keep it. You can keep it relevant, and we'll probably put it on the show. Or you can just send us, general art stuff that we might include. We like to include at the end of each thing if we have some time.
Yep. And check out our DeviantArt page, which is cutieartcrusaders.deviantart.com, and all of our artwork that we feature on the podcast will be there in our favorites folders. And you can
that's actually a really convenient thing that we have. If you go to cutieartcrusaders.deviantart.com, right there, like right at the very front, you'll see something called collections or favorites. And if you head into our favorites, along the left-hand side, you're going to see folders for like episode 1, episode 2, etc., etc. And if you go in there, that's all of the artwork that we favorited there.
We'll try to include some honorable mentions that might have fit the theme we weren't talking about, but we didn't get to.
Yeah, so if you want to go check that out, you might see a couple of more pieces in there. Just a little motivation to go check it out.
And if you have a DeviantArt account, you can feel free to watch us, because I'm sure we'll be posting journals and stuff with the new episodes and whatnot. So yeah.
All right.
I think that's pretty much it.
And that's basically it. And if that's everything for you guys, right?
Yeah, I'm good.
Sounds good.
All right, then this is Rainbow Plasma signing out. Thanks for watching, guys.
I'm Burndo1.
And I'm Flutter Guy. We'll see you next week.
Thanks again.
See ya. Is while keeping it kind of, relevant to each other. So this week's theme is show accuracy. So, for example, in this week, we'll be talking a lot about show accuracy and how that relates to fan art and how it can be used properly, improperly, all that jazz. So, just to start off, I'm going to talk a little bit about what show accuracy is, and then Bern's going to talk about a little bit about vectoring. So, show accuracy is basically what it sounds like. It's the similarities to the show. So if you have a show accurate piece of fan art, it means it looks almost exactly or very close to what the show looks like. It uses very similar styles or shading or whatever to make it look like it came from the show itself. And that's basically it. I mean,
At least just mimics the style of the show.
Yeah, it mimics it, and it's a way to relate the fan art back to the show. Vectors, as we mentioned last week, vectors are a very good way of doing this, and they're the prime example of a show-accurate piece of fan art, because, well, that's hopefully now you've kind of recognized our voices. By the way, Pinky Dash is away this week. He's off doing Australian things. I'm not really sure.
Whatever Australians do.
I mean, somebody needs to inform me about what Australians actually do, because
I think he's taming koalas.
he might be rescuing his kangaroo from a crocodile. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I could do an accent to kind of like make up for the fact he's here, but I'm horrible at accents.
Don't even try. Yeah.
No, I'm not even gonna try. Okay, so this week we've got something really special for you. We've got kind of what the show's going to be. I remember last week we had this like drag about having to show our own work, and we were not really excited about that, and blah blah blah. So this week we actually get to go in more in depth about art itself. So to do that, what we're going to do each week is we're going to have something called a theme. And the theme for each week is going to be kind of a way for us to focus our thoughts about art and display different pieces, what they're trying to do. Most of vectors are trying to imitate the show, whether that be through tracing or original style or stuff like that. But I feel like last week we didn't really get into what a vector was. People might have been a little bit confused about what a vector was. So I'm going to have Bernd here explain a little bit more in detail about what a vector is so that you guys have just a little bit more of a clear idea.
Alrighty. Well, What is a vector? Basically, to kind of sum it all up, a vector is a recreation of an image or creation of an image using paths, strokes, and shapes. And basically, to kind of sum that down, what a shape in vectoring is, it's kind of like a cutout piece of paper, but it's a magical little piece of paper that you can infinitely scale however you'd like. So a vector is an image that you would see that people create from the show using paths and strokes and different programs, but it can infinitely scale, so you can put it on the side of a billboard, you can put it, and then you can make it the size of an icon, and it will never lose.
Hello and welcome back to the Cutie Art Crusaders, episode 2, part 2 of the back-to-back premiere that we're running this week on Everfree Radio. Welcome back, guys. It's a bit awkward because we're recording this about a week after we recorded the first one, but I'll get into that in a moment. For right now, I am your host, Rainbow Plasma, and today I'm joined by...
Burn-Doll1.
And Flutter Guy.
So yeah, like I mentioned before, we're recording this a week later. We were going to release that one last week and do that, but there's a bunch of complications, so we decided just to run like a 2-episode premiere. So now you get back-to-back of us. And
Resolution, because it's making these little cutout pieces of shapes and complex polygons and curves. So the effort put into making a vector isn't quite the same as drawing. It's almost designing an image to be able to look how you want it to look, no matter what the resolution.
It's a very mathematical way to make art. It's less flowy. Like if you're using like a brush, it's not as flowy as that. It's more about, you know, clicking and dragging lines. It's a very it's like the math nerd's way to make art.
I've heard it been called the perfectionist's art because you're constantly tweaking things, and it's not really about, you know, going through with a brush and trying to make things look right that way. It's more you're constantly like going back and forth and trying to get everything to fit together properly.
Yeah, definitely. In vectoring, like it's code. I forget what type of code, but you can actually go in a vector and you can problem solve the code and see if there's some like glitches or problems with the code, because every single point and every single line